What if the very system meant to protect you was designed to break you? A powerful bank, a corrupt executive, and a woman who refuses to back down. When Natalie Monroe steps into her new role, she discovers a web of deception buried deep within First Horizon Bank. But when she exposes the truth, the system fights back. Hard, betrayal, power struggles, and a battle for justice unfold. Will she take them down before they destroy her? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. It was Natalie Monroe's first day as the branch manager of First Horizon Bank, and while the title carried a sense of accomplishment, it also came with an unshakable weight of responsibility. She had worked hard to get here, years as a financial consultant, building trust with clients, proving herself in a system that rarely welcomed women like her in leadership roles. Now she was finally in charge. But being in charge didn't mean being in control, at least not yet. She took a deep breath and hailed a cab, her mind already processing the long day ahead. The First Horizon Bank building stood tall in the heart of downtown, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Inside, the usual rhythm of a busy workday had already set in. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the low murmur of tellers assisting customers. It was an environment built on order, efficiency, and routine. Natalie pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. No one noticed her at first. A few employees passed by, too caught up in their conversations or morning tasks to acknowledge the new arrival. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. She took slow, deliberate steps, scanning the floor. She wasn't just here to manage, she was here to observe, to understand how things worked before making any changes. She had read the reports, the customer complaints, the unaddressed concerns. But papers only told one side of the story. She needed to see it for herself. As she approached the reception desk, a young woman in a dark green blouse looked up, offering a polite but distracted smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" For a split second, Natalie debated whether to introduce herself immediately, but she decided against it. She wasn't here for grand entrances or self-important speeches. "I have a meeting scheduled this morning," she said simply, "with the branch manager." The receptionist blinked. "Oh, Mr. Larkin. He's out of the office today." Natalie's brow lifted slightly. Greg Larkin, the former branch manager. She had expected to meet him at least once before stepping into his role. "Oh," she said, keeping her expression neutral. "That's too bad." The receptionist tapped at her keyboard. "I can call someone else for you if you'd like." "No need," Natalie replied, still surveying the room. "I'll just take a look around." As she walked past the reception desk, she felt a few pairs of eyes flick in her direction. Not curiosity, skepticism. The kind of glance reserved for outsiders, for someone who didn't quite belong. She was used to that. The morning rush at First Horizon Bank was already in full swing. The line at the teller counters stretched back toward the entrance, customers shifting impatiently as they checked their watches or tapped their feet. Near the entrance, Eleanor Whitmore stepped inside, gripping the handle of her purse with both hands. She hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her bearings, then slowly made her way toward the nearest counter. She was a small woman, just past 80, her posture slightly hunched, but her presence dignified. Her white cardigan hung loosely over a simple floral dress, and the gold watch on her frail wrist looked decades old, its band slightly worn. As she approached, her eyes scanned the employees, looking for a familiar face. The line of customers moved at a steady pace, but she didn't step into it. Instead, she hesitated near the side of the counter, unsure where to begin. Dylan Carter, a young teller, no older than 22, noticed her from behind his station. His fingers froze over the keyboard as he debated whether to speak up. He had seen her before, a few months ago maybe. She had come in asking about an old savings account, struggling to recall the details. He swallowed hard. He wanted to help, but he had been warned before. Don't waste time on customers who slow down operations. So he hesitated, and that was when Greg Larkin entered the scene. The man carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked authority. He was in his early 50s, his graying hair neatly combed back, his navy blue suit pressed but unremarkable. He walked with purpose, his steps sharp against the polished tile floors, his expression already impatient before he even reached Eleanor. "Ma'am, do you need something?" His tone was clipped, his irritation barely masked. Eleanor turned toward him, her brows knitting together. "Yes, I came to ask about my savings account," she said softly. Her voice was steady but slow, her words careful. Greg exhaled sharply through his nose. "And what exactly is the problem?" She fumbled with the clasp of her purse, pulling out a folded slip of paper. I, I think I wrote it down somewhere. I just need to check my balance, but Greg didn't let her finish. "Ma'am, if you don't know your account details, we can't help you." His voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of the customers in line. "You need to be prepared when you come in here. We don't have time to guess what you need." Dylan's fingers tightened over the keyboard. He glanced toward his coworker, Sarah Kim, who had also stopped typing. Her lips pressed together, her shoulders tensed, but like him, she said nothing. Eleanor looked up, confused. I, I'm sorry, I just need a moment to—" Greg threw up a hand. "We don't have a moment. Either step aside and figure it out, or come back when you actually have your information." The room seemed to grow quieter, the low hum of conversation fading as a few customers turned to watch. Someone in line snickered, another muttered under their breath, and then Greg delivered the final blow. "Honestly, ma'am, you need to stop wasting our time. If you don't even know what you're looking for, just leave." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind of laugh that wasn't necessarily malicious, but indifferent. People too busy with their own frustrations to care about someone else's. Eleanor's fingers clutched the paper in her hands, her grip trembling slightly. She took a step back, her gaze darting toward the door, her face flushing with embarrassment. Dylan's chest tightened. He wanted to speak up. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of Greg's authority held him in place. And just a few steps away, near the glass partition separating the tellers from the executive offices, Natalie Monroe watched everything unfold. She had been standing there for several minutes, unnoticed, her arms loosely crossed. Her expression remained unreadable, but her jaw was set, her gaze sharp. Greg had no idea she was there. As Eleanor turned and made her way toward the exit, Natalie felt the tension in her shoulders rise. She could step in now. She could put Greg in his place right this second. But she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, slipping into the corridor leading to the management offices. This wasn't something to be handled in a moment of anger. This was something to be dismantled from the inside out. Minutes later, she was seated behind her desk, her laptop open in front of her. She didn't hesitate. She navigated straight to the internal complaint database, her fingers flying over the keyboard. It was time to see exactly how long Greg Larkin had been getting away with this. And once she had the proof, he wouldn't see it coming. Natalie sat at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, her mind already a few steps ahead. The quiet hum of the office settled around her, punctuated only by the distant sound of phones ringing and muffled conversations beyond her door. She had spent years navigating corporate politics, learning when to push forward and when to wait, but she had never been one to sit back when something needed to be fixed. And Greg Larkin was broken. She opened the internal complaint system, the sterile blue and white interface glowing on her screen. Her fingers moved quickly, typing in his name, filtering results, narrowing them down. Within seconds, a flood of reports filled the screen, stretching back 5 years. Her jaw tightened as she skimmed through them. Multiple complaints from elderly customers, all following the same pattern. Rude behavior, denied transactions without explanation, condescending remarks. Internal reports from employees, some anonymous, alleging that Greg had threatened and bullied staff who challenged him. A flagged report from a financial oversight committee, noting a procedural discrepancy in Greg's handling of a large account withdrawal, something that had the potential to turn into a legal nightmare for the bank if investigated further. Yet every single complaint ended the same way. Status: unresolved. Natalie leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Someone had been protecting him. Whether it was negligence or intentional cover-up, she didn't know yet. But what she did know was that Greg had been allowed to operate unchecked for years, and no one had done anything about it. A sharp knock at the door broke her thoughts. She looked up. Dylan Carter. The young intern stood there, shifting awkwardly on his feet. He had the nervous energy of someone who had been called into the principal's office, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dress slacks. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, his shoulders stiff as he stepped inside. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice cautious. Natalie gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Dylan." He hesitated, then complied, his fingers lacing together as he sat. "You've been here for what, 5 months?" she asked, her tone even. He nodded. "Almost 6. And in those 6 months, how many times have you seen Greg mistreat a customer?" Dylan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "A lot," he admitted. Natalie kept her eyes on him. "Have you ever spoken up about it?" His hands clenched slightly. "No." "Why not?" He exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the door, as if making sure no one was listening. "Because I saw what happened to the last guy who did." Natalie leaned forward slightly. "Tell me." Dylan hesitated again, but there was something about the way she asked. Calm, but firm. She wasn't just fishing for gossip. She wanted the truth. "There was this guy," Dylan started, rubbing his thumb over his knuckles. "Ben Foster. He was here when I started. Good guy, a little older, really cared about the customers. One day, Greg snapped at an old woman, kind of like today. Ben tried to step in, told Greg he was out of line." Natalie's eyes sharpened. "And?" Dylan let out a bitter laugh. "Greg had him written up for insubordination. Then suddenly, Ben started getting scheduled for all the worst shifts. Every time he made a small mistake, Greg would jump on it. After a few weeks, he just quit." Natalie exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers together. "Greg didn't just mistreat customers. He actively punished anyone who tried to stop him." "Dylan," she said after a beat, her voice softer now, "you knew this was wrong, so why tell me now?" Dylan looked at her, really looked at her, and Natalie saw something shift in his expression. "Because you're the first person I think might actually do something about it." She nodded, absorbing that. Then she reached for a legal pad on her desk. "There's something I need your help with." Dylan tensed slightly. "What is it?" She set her pen down, leveling her gaze at him. "Have you ever heard of a customer named Frank Callahan?" His brows furrowed in thought. "No, I don't think so. Why?" Natalie turned the legal pad toward him, where she had written down the name. "There's a missing complaint in the system, a serious one, a complaint that never got filed. I need you to find out why." Dylan's lips parted slightly. "You think someone covered it up?" "I think Greg made sure it disappeared," she said bluntly. Dylan hesitated again, but this time it wasn't the same nervous hesitation as before. He was weighing something, considering it. Then finally he nodded. "Okay, I'll see what I can find." Natalie offered him a small smile. "Good." As Dylan left the office, Natalie exhaled, looking back at the screen filled with unresolved complaints. Greg Larkin wasn't just an inconvenience, he was a liability. And if there was one thing banks hated, it was liabilities. Greg Larkin had spent over 2 decades in banking, and in that time, he had learned one valuable lesson: control the environment, and nothing can touch you. He prided himself on maintaining a branch that ran exactly how he wanted it to. The moment he stepped onto the main floor of First Horizon that morning, he sensed it. Something was off. The usual rhythm of the bank had changed. Employees were still at their desks, still assisting customers, still going about their work. But there was something in the way they moved. Quieter conversations, stolen glances, the kind of energy that hummed under the surface when people knew something they weren't supposed to say aloud. He approached the teller line, his gaze sharp as he scanned the faces around him. A pair of junior employees whispered near the copy machine. 2 tellers at the counter barely lifted their heads when he passed by. And then, just faintly, he caught his own name murmured between them. He stopped walking. One of the tellers, a middle-aged man named Eric, cleared his throat as soon as he realized Greg was looking. The younger woman beside him, whose name Greg never bothered to remember, immediately turned back to her work. Greg narrowed his eyes. "You two look busy," he said smoothly. His voice was calm, but both tellers knew better than to think it was friendly. Eric nodded quickly. Just catching up on some morning reports, sir. Greg held his gaze for a moment longer before continuing toward his office. It wasn't paranoia. Something was happening, and he needed to find out what. The moment he stepped onto the second floor, he spotted another red flag. Sarah Kim, one of the more experienced tellers, was leaning over the cubicle partition, whispering something to a fellow employee. Her eyes darted toward him when she sensed his presence. Greg stopped in his tracks. Something interesting, Kim? Sarah's back stiffened. No, sir. Just reviewing a client file. Greg let the silence drag a beat too long before nodding and moving past her. That was when he heard it. The new manager's looking into the complaints, a voice whispered. Greg slowed his steps. Another voice, too quiet to place, murmured, I heard she pulled old reports. The ones about... The rest was lost in a shuffle of papers. Greg's pulse ticked up. His fingers curled at his sides. South. That's what this was. Natalie Monroe. She had only been here a few days, but already she was sniffing around things that weren't her business. And worse, people were talking. He had underestimated her. By the time Greg reached the branch manager's office, his irritation had sharpened into something colder. He needed to test her. He adjusted his cuffs, took a breath, then stepped inside without knocking. Natalie was at her desk, typing something on her laptop. She didn't startle when he entered, nor did she look particularly surprised to see him. Instead, she merely lifted her gaze, cool and measured. Greg smiled, the same easy practice smile that had disarmed board members, senior executives, and even the occasional client over the years. Natalie, he greeted, his tone effortlessly friendly. I realize we haven't had the chance to properly talk. She leaned back slightly in her chair. That's true. Greg took that as an invitation and closed the door behind him before stepping forward. I just wanted to see how you were settling in, he continued, sliding into the seat across from her desk. I know taking over a new branch can be overwhelming. Natalie studied him for a moment before offering a small, polite smile. It's been an interesting adjustment. Good to hear, Greg said, nodding. He folded his hands together, keeping his tone casual. I also heard you've been looking through some files. Just routine review, I assume? Natalie didn't flinch. Of course. Greg waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. Something about the way she sat, composed, unreadable, irritated him. He was used to people reacting a certain way when he questioned them. Defensiveness, excuses, even fear. Natalie gave him none of that. Well, he said after a pause, if you ever need anything clarified, I'm happy to help. She nodded. I appreciate that. Greg let the silence linger. He studied her face, looking for some sign that she knew what he was really asking, but Natalie's expression remained unchanged. Finally, he forced another smile and stood. I won't take up any more of your time. Natalie smiled in return, but there was something undeniably sharp behind it. Have a good day, Greg. As he left her office, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Uncertainty. Down on the main floor, Dylan Carter was too caught up in his own thoughts to notice Greg approaching. He had spent the last hour digging into old transaction logs, trying to make sense of the missing complaint Natalie had asked about. He knew it was risky, but part of him felt like he owed it to her. He had spent too long staying silent. That was why he didn't notice Greg until it was too late. A firm hand clamped onto his shoulder. Dylan turned sharply, his stomach dropping, when he met Greg's cold, calculating stare. Walk with me, Greg said. Dylan had no choice but to follow. Greg led him toward a quieter corner of the bank, away from the other employees. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry, but there was an unmistakable edge of warning in his tone. I overheard you talking earlier, Greg said lightly. Something about old complaints? Dylan swallowed. I was just... Greg didn't let him finish. You seem like a smart kid, Dylan, he said, his voice smooth, almost reassuring. And smart people know how to mind their own business. Dylan's pulse pounded in his ears. Greg took a step closer. So let me give you a little advice. If you want a future here, keep your head down. Don't get involved in things that don't concern you. Dylan clenched his jaw. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he nodded. Greg patted his shoulder, a mockery of encouragement. Good man. And with that, he walked away. Dylan stood frozen, his mind racing. He should back off. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he watched Greg disappear into his office, something inside him hardened, because he realized fear wasn't the worst thing he could feel. Regret was. Greg Larkin knew how to survive in this business. The key wasn't just playing the game, it was making sure no one else even realized there was a game in the first place. That was how he had lasted this long. That was why, even now, as Natalie Monroe quietly worked to dismantle everything he had built, he refused to panic. Instead, he adjusted his tie, took a slow breath, and started fixing the problem. The first thing he did was make a phone call. Seated in his office, Greg leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk as he waited for the line to connect. It rang twice before a voice answered, a low, measured tone belonging to Mark Delaney, head of the bank's IT department. Greg, Delaney greeted, his voice thick with familiarity. What can I do for you? Greg glanced at his office door, ensuring it was shut, then kept his tone light. I need you to check something for me. A few reports that might be floating around in the system. Some complaints that should have been handled a long time ago. Delaney didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, there was a note of hesitation. You're talking about the flagged files? Greg's grip on the receiver tightened, so he wasn't the only one who had noticed. Nothing major, Greg said smoothly. Just some unnecessary clutter. You know how these systems get. People file complaints, problems get resolved, but no one cleans up the records. It's messy. I need it cleaned up. There was another pause, then a sigh. How messy are we talking? Greg smiled. The kind of mess that shouldn't exist anymore. Delaney exhaled heavily. I'll see what I can do. Greg nodded to himself. Appreciate it. By the time he hung up, his confidence had been restored. Natalie might think she was making progress, but soon there wouldn't be any records left to find. That was only step one. Step two was turning the bank against her. It started subtly. Comments dropped into conversations, casual observations made in passing. Greg knew better than to launch an open attack. That wasn't how you got rid of someone like Natalie. You had to let them trip over their own feet. At the coffee machine in the break room, he spoke just loud enough for a few employees to overhear. She's been digging into old files. I get wanting to understand the branch, but it feels more like she's trying to control it. In the hallway near the conference rooms, he let out a thoughtful sigh while speaking to a junior manager. She's ambitious, I'll give her that. But have you noticed, it's not about the customers, it's about showing she's in charge. By lunchtime, whispers had spread. Sarah Kim, one of the longest-serving employees at the branch, had always been loyal to stability, to routine, to the idea that if she just kept her head down, she'd keep her job. She wasn't particularly loyal to Greg, but she feared change more than she disliked him. So when Greg approached her, it wasn't difficult to nudge her in the direction he needed. She's going to upend everything, he told her, shaking his head. You've been here long enough to know, when people start making changes this quickly, layoffs follow. Sarah's expression tensed. I don't know what she's planning, Greg continued, lowering his voice, but you should be careful. You and I both know how easily people in your position can be replaced. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't even need much convincing. Fear did most of the work for him. By late afternoon, Greg was feeling good, until he saw Natalie standing outside his office, arms crossed, waiting for him. She wasn't smiling. Greg took a moment to compose himself, then let a slow grin spread across his face as he approached. Well, this is a surprise, he said, pushing open the door and stepping inside. Come on in. Natalie followed, closing the door behind her. Greg settled into his chair, acting as though this were nothing more than a routine conversation. What's on your mind? Natalie tilted her head slightly. I noticed some files have gone missing from the internal database. Greg lifted a brow, feigning curiosity. Missing? Complaints, she clarified. Several of them. He shrugged. That's strange. Maybe a system error? Natalie didn't blink. Or maybe someone's trying to erase them. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind Greg's eyes. A break in the facade. Then just as quickly, the mask was back. That's a serious accusation, he said, chuckling softly. You've only been here a few days, Natalie. I've been here more than 20 years. I know what's best for this branch. Natalie held his gaze. Do you? Greg's smile thinned. I hope so, she continued, because I don't take well to people interfering with customer records. Greg leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. You know, he mused, when you first got here, I thought you'd be a great addition. But I'm starting to wonder if you understand how things work. There's a balance to these places. The way we do things, it's not about being perfect, it's about being practical. Natalie nodded. I see. And you think keeping complaints off the books is practical? Greg's patience was thinning. I think keeping a branch running efficiently is what matters. Natalie gave a slow, deliberate nod, then stood. Good to know. Greg watched as she turned to leave, feeling something uncomfortably close to irritation rising in his chest. She hadn't accused him outright. She hadn't made a move yet, but she wasn't backing down either. As the door shut behind her, Greg exhaled and leaned back. He had expected her to challenge him. He hadn't expected her to be this good at it. Still, she was playing defense. He was the one making the moves. And as far as Greg was concerned, he was still in control. The air inside First Horizon Bank felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of something unseen had settled over the branch. The late morning rush had thinned out, leaving behind only a handful of customers, some seated in the waiting area, others lingering at the teller counters. The quiet hum of activity masked the growing tension among the employees, but Dylan Carter could feel it, and he wasn't the only one. Near the front of the bank, a woman in her late 70s approached one of the tellers. She walked with careful, deliberate steps, her hand gripping the strap of her purse. Her name was Margaret Dawson, and she had been banking at First Horizon for over 30 years. Dylan watched as she stopped in front of the counter, her frail fingers reaching into her bag to pull out a neatly folded stack of documents. She smiled at the teller, an earnest, patient expression on her face. Good morning, dear, she said softly. I'm here to withdraw some money from my account. The teller, a young man who looked barely out of college, glanced at the paperwork before nodding. Of course, ma'am. I'll just need to verify your information. Margaret nodded, sliding her identification across the counter. She had everything she needed. Her ID, her account number, even her most recent statement. It should have been simple. But then Greg Larkin appeared. Dylan stiffened when he saw Greg stride toward the counter, his expression tight with impatience. This wasn't going to end well. Greg leaned in slightly, scanning the paperwork with a critical eye. What's going on here? The teller hesitated. Mrs. Dawson is withdrawing funds from her account. Greg barely glanced at Margaret before shaking his head. No, she's not. Margaret blinked, startled. Excuse me? Greg exhaled sharply, as if the situation itself was exhausting. You don't have the proper paperwork. The teller frowned. But sir, she has... Greg cut him off. You need 2 forms of ID for a withdrawal over $5,000, bank policy. Margaret looked confused. But I've done this before. My passport is at home, but I always use my driver's license. It's never been an issue. Greg's smile was thin, dismissive. Well, it's an issue now. Dylan clenched his jaw. She had everything she needed. Greg was just making things difficult for no reason. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her papers. But my social security number is on the statement, and Greg sighed loudly, making a show of checking his watch. Look, if you don't have the right documents, I can't help you. Maybe come back when you're prepared. The way he said it, like she was an inconvenience, like she wasn't worth his time, made Dylan's stomach turn. Margaret's face fell. Please, I really need to make this withdrawal today. Greg's expression didn't soften. If anything, his patience seemed to snap. I don't have time for this, he muttered. Then in a louder voice, maybe if you can't remember how to handle your own accounts, you shouldn't be banking here at all. A few customers turned to look. Someone near the waiting area shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's lips parted slightly, her eyes blinking rapidly. For a moment, she just stood there, humiliated, before reaching for her papers with trembling hands. Dylan felt something inside him tighten. This wasn't just rude. This was wrong. and he made a decision without thinking. He reached into his pocket, slid his phone out just enough to tap the record button, then let it rest at his side. Greg wasn't just going to get away with this. 20 minutes later, Dylan sat in the break room, his heart still pounding. The recording sat in his phone, the audio clear and damning. Maybe if you can't remember how to handle your own accounts, you shouldn't be banking here at all. Dylan swallowed hard. He had done it. He had proof. Now came the hard part, what to do with it. His first instinct was to go straight to Natalie, but a part of him hesitated. What if this backfired? What if Greg found out and made sure he never worked in banking again? As if on cue, his phone vibrated with a text. Natalie, come to my office. Now Dylan exhaled sharply. She must have seen what happened. There was no turning back now. Natalie sat at her desk, her arms folded, her expression unreadable as Dylan placed his phone on the desk. I have proof, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. She raised an eyebrow. Proof? He nodded, unlocking the phone and pressing play. Greg's voice filled the room. Cold, arrogant, dismissive. Maybe if you can't remember how to handle your own accounts, you shouldn't be banking here at all. Natalie listened in silence. When the recording ended, she leaned back, exhaling through her nose. Then she looked at Dylan. Send this to me. His hands felt clammy as he did. What now? Natalie's eyes darkened. Now? We end him. She grabbed her phone, dialing quickly. Who are you calling? Dylan asked. Legal, Natalie said, her voice sharp. This is about to get official. Dylan swallowed. And Greg? Natalie's lips pressed together. He's going to regret every word of that sentence. Greg Larkin was halfway through an email when he got the call. His phone buzzed. The number was internal. He answered. Larkin. A pause, then, this is Mitchell Hayes, First Horizon's corporate legal team. We need to speak with you immediately. Greg's stomach clenched. About what? Another pause. A complaint has been filed against you, and we have a recording to review. You'll be required to join a formal inquiry. Greg's fingers tightened around the phone. Recording. His mind raced. Someone had recorded him. His jaw clenched as realization hit him. Dylan. That little rat. Greg ended the call without another word, stood abruptly and strode out of his office. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't over. He'd make sure of that. Greg Larkin sat at his desk, tapping his fingers against the polished wood surface. The morning had been a disaster, and the unease creeping into his gut wasn't something he could shake off. The email from corporate legal still lingered in his inbox, unread since he had slammed his laptop shut in frustration. He was losing control. A sharp knock on his door made him flinch. Before he could respond, the door swung open, and Natalie Monroe stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind her. Greg masked his discomfort with a smirk. Well, this is a surprise. Natalie didn't speak. She walked forward, pulled out her phone, and placed it on his desk. Then she pressed play. His own voice filled the room, cold, dismissive, unmistakable. Maybe if you can't remember how to handle your own accounts, you shouldn't be banking here at all. Greg's smirk faded. The recording played out in full. Every venomous word, every ounce of contempt he had poured into his voice that morning. When it ended, silence followed, thick and suffocating. Natalie didn't move. She just watched him. Greg cleared his throat, leaning back in his chair as if unaffected. That could have been edited, he said casually. Natalie raised an eyebrow. You think so? Greg forced a chuckle. You know how technology is. People can manipulate audio, make it sound like anything. Natalie leaned forward, planting both hands on his desk. The legal department has already verified the recording. Greg's face twitched. That proves nothing. It proves everything. Natalie's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Controlled, sharp. And the best part? This isn't the only complaint against you. In fact, Dylan Carter has something you might find interesting. The door opened again, and Dylan stepped in, a file tucked under his arm. He walked straight to Natalie's side, his gaze unwavering as he placed the stack of documents on Greg's desk. Every time you've manipulated the system, Dylan said, every complaint you erased, Every report that should have reached corporate but didn't. It's all here. Greg's confidence cracked. His fingers twitched toward his keyboard. But before he could reach it, Natalie smiled. I already revoked your access to the system, she said simply. Greg's breath hitched. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. Outside the office, the tension in the bank was palpable. A few employees had gathered near the hallway, whispers passing between them. The air was charged with something unspoken, a sense that something big was happening behind that closed door. Sarah Kim stood among them, her arms crossed tightly. She had always stayed out of things, but now she wasn't sure where she stood. Greg had been in charge for so long, but if what people were saying was true, the tide was shifting. Inside, Greg was running out of options. His voice grew louder, more desperate. You think this is enough to take me down? I've been here longer than either of you. I know how this bank works. And that's exactly the problem. Natalie didn't flinch. You've spent years covering your tracks, intimidating employees, mistreating customers. But now, there's proof. And this time, you can't erase it. Greg slammed a fist against the desk. You think corporate is going to fire me over this? Over some old woman who probably didn't even know what she was asking for? The words had barely left his mouth when the office door swung open again. And this time, it wasn't Dylan who walked in. A man in his 60s dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit stepped inside. His presence alone was enough to silence the room. Greg froze. Natalie straightened. Harrison Blake, the regional director of First Horizon Bank. He clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. I think, he said smoothly, we should discuss this privately. Natalie watched Greg closely as Harrison took a seat. The shift in Greg's posture was unmistakable. The way his shoulders stiffened, the subtle clench of his jaw. He hadn't expected this. Neither had she. Harrison glanced between them, then let out a sigh, as if the entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. Let's be practical here, he said, his tone even. There's no need for rash decisions. Greg has been with this bank for over 20 years. We can all agree that an internal resolution would be in everyone's best interest. Natalie narrowed her eyes. An internal resolution. Greg wasn't acting alone. She had suspected as much, but now she knew for sure. He had protection higher up. Dylan shifted uncomfortably beside her. Sir, with all due respect, Harrison held up a hand, stopping him. I appreciate your concern, Dylan, but this is beyond your level of authority. Dylan pressed his lips together, but didn't back down. Greg, for his part, was no longer panicked. He sat up straighter, his composure slowly returning. I couldn't have said it better myself, he said smoothly. This isn't a scandal. It's a misunderstanding. Natalie fought the urge to laugh. A misunderstanding? Harrison exhaled through his nose. Natalie, I understand you want to make an impact here, and I respect that. But a public scandal isn't good for anyone. Not for you, not for Greg, and certainly not for this bank. Natalie tilted her head. And what do you propose instead? Harrison folded his hands. A transition. Greg will be reassigned. Quietly. No media attention. No unnecessary escalation. Reassigned. They wanted to move him instead of holding him accountable. Natalie let the silence stretch, considering her next move. If she pushed too hard now, Harrison would shut her down completely. She needed a different approach. She glanced at Dylan, then at the file on Greg's desk. Finally, she met Harrison's gaze. I'll consider your proposal. Greg smirked. Harrison nodded. That's all I ask? Natalie turned on her heel and walked out of the office. Dylan right behind her. The moment the door shut, Dylan whispered, You're not actually considering it, are you? Natalie's jaw tightened. Of course not. Dylan exhaled in relief. Natalie's eyes flickered toward Harrison's office. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was about an entire system that allowed men like him to thrive, and she was going to burn it to the ground. End of chapter. Natalie sat across from Harrison Blake, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. The blinds in his office were half drawn, letting in slivers of the afternoon light. But the atmosphere inside felt dim, heavy with unspoken intentions. Harrison leaned back in his chair, watching her with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. I'm going to be frank with you, he said, steepling his fingers. Greg Larkin is not worth the trouble you're stirring up. Natalie didn't respond right away. She let the words settle, let them hang between them like a challenge. Harrison took her silence as permission to continue. He's been here for years. He has his faults, sure. But you've been here, what, a few weeks? And already you're treating this like some kind of personal crusade. Natalie tilted her head slightly. I'm treating it like a professional obligation. Harrison chuckled, shaking his head. That's a noble way to put it. But let's be clear. You're making waves, and waves disrupt business. And trust me, corporate does not like disruptions. He opened a folder on his desk, sliding a sheet of paper toward her. This is a solution that benefits everyone, he continued smoothly. Greg will be reassigned to another branch. You won't have to deal with him again, and there won't be any unnecessary bad press. In exchange, he tapped the paper, we'll expedite your career path. A regional position in the near future, higher pay, more influence. It's a win-win. Natalie picked up the paper, glancing over it. It was dressed up in corporate language, phrases like personnel realignment and leadership transition. But at its core, it was a payoff. They wanted her silence. She set the paper down carefully. And if I say no? Harrison's smile didn't falter, but there was a new weight in his gaze. You wouldn't be the first manager to come in here thinking they could change everything overnight. He folded his hands again. And you wouldn't be the first one to disappear either. There it was, the threat. Natalie exhaled slowly, looking past Harrison toward the window. The streets of Chicago stretched beyond the glass, cars moving in steady lines, people going about their lives without knowing the battle happening in this very room. She had expected resistance, but now, sitting here, staring at the man who represented everything wrong with his system, she realized something. Greg Larkin wasn't the real problem. Greg was just a symptom. The real issue was the system that allowed men like him to thrive. Harrison wasn't just protecting Greg. He was protecting himself, his influence, and the fragile ecosystem of unchecked power that had been built over years. And now he was daring her to fall in line. Natalie looked back at him, her expression calm. I'll think about it. Harrison nodded, satisfied. Smart choice. But he had no idea what she was really thinking. Back in her office, Natalie shut the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, inhaling deeply. Her mind was already working through her next steps, sorting through options. She knew what she was supposed to do. Take the deal. Move up the ladder. Play along. But the idea made her stomach turn. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. Dylan Carter stepped inside hesitantly, closing the door behind him. He looked tense, like he had been holding something in since their meeting with Greg. You're not actually going to take that deal, are you? He asked. Natalie studied him for a moment. There was no fear in his eyes this time, only determination. She shook her head. No. Dylan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. But that means things are going to get messy, she continued. For both of us. Dylan shrugged. I figured as much. He hesitated, then added, if we don't do something, this keeps happening. It doesn't stop with Greg. Natalie nodded. I know. She turned toward her desk, pulling out her phone. Dylan frowned. What are you doing? She scrolled through her contacts, then pressed call. The bank won't handle this internally, she said, pressing the phone to her ear. So we take it outside. The call connected. Clara Reeves, Natalie said smoothly. This is Natalie Monroe from First Horizon Bank. I think I have a story for you. Dylan's eyes widened slightly. A reporter? Natalie nodded. If Harrison wanted to play politics, fine. She was about to take his entire system into the public eye. Later that evening, Natalie stood by her office window, watching the city below. She had just handed over evidence of systemic misconduct, customer complaints, financial discrepancies, the recording of Greg Larkin's verbal abuse, and now proof that corporate leadership had tried to cover it up. This wasn't just about getting rid of Greg anymore. This was about forcing change. She wasn't sure what the fallout would be, but one thing was clear. Harrison Blake and Greg Larkin were about to realize she wasn't playing by their rules anymore. The morning air in Chicago carried an unusual tension, thick and unshakable. At First Horizon Bank, employees moved with forced normalcy, But beneath their routine motions, there was unease. The air felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. The storm arrived at exactly 8:15 a.m. Natalie Monroe sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, when her email notifications exploded. One subject line after another filled her inbox. Breaking news. First Horizon scandal. Bank execs caught in cover-up. Financial power play exposed. She clicked on the first link. The headline from the Chicago Financial Tribune stared back at her in bold black letters. Abuse of power. How First Horizon Bank betrayed its customers. Beneath it, the byline. Clara Reeves, investigative reporter. Natalie scanned the article. It was damning. It detailed Greg Larkin's years of misconduct, listing customer complaints, employee accounts, and most critically, the secret recording of his verbal abuse toward an elderly customer. Then it went further. It exposed Harrison Blake's direct involvement in shielding Greg from consequences, highlighting how complaints had been erased, how corporate had quietly relocated problematic managers rather than holding them accountable. It wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was about systemic corruption. Natalie exhaled. She had expected backlash. She had expected noise. What she hadn't expected was how fast it would spread. Within minutes, social media erupted. Customers, financial watchdogs, even former employees started sharing their own experiences. The comments section of First Horizon's official page flooded with outrage. Natalie's phone buzzed. A text from Dylan. "We did it," she exhaled. They had forced the truth into the light, but truth alone wouldn't be enough to win. Because she knew Harrison Blake wasn't going to go down quietly. By 10:30 a.m., Harrison was in full damage control mode. He sat at the head of a long, polished conference table in the executive boardroom, his expression unreadable. Across from him, the entire First Horizon board of directors had assembled. Banking elites in press suits, each with their own vested interest in keeping their reputations clean. At the far end of the table, Greg Larkin sat with his shoulders hunched, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. No one was looking at him with sympathy. Harrison steepled his fingers. "We have two options," he said, his voice measured. "Either we let this situation spiral out of control, or we get ahead of it." A board member adjusted his tie. "What are you proposing?" Harrison glanced at Greg, then back at the board. "We cut him loose." Greg's head snapped up. "What?" Harrison's expression remained unreadable. "The public wants a villain. Let's give them one." Greg let out a sharp breath. "You're throwing me under the bus?" Harrison shrugged. "You're the one who made it easy." A murmur rippled through the room. Some board members exchanged looks, nodding subtly. Greg's face reddened. "This isn't just me, and you know it." He leaned forward. "You're the one who told me to handle things quietly. You knew exactly how I ran this branch." Harrison remained impassive. "Prove it." Greg opened his mouth, then shut it. Because he couldn't. Everything had been verbal. Every order, every warning, every suggestion from Harrison had been careful, calculated, undocumented. Greg had followed them blindly, trusting that his protection would last forever. But there was no loyalty in corporate power. Only survival. Harrison turned back to the board. "We release a statement condemning Greg's behavior, reaffirming our commitment to ethical banking. We initiate an internal investigation, one that finds he acted alone." A woman at the table nodded. "And what about Monroe?" Harrison's jaw tightened. Natalie wasn't like Greg. She was dangerous in a different way because she wasn't corrupt. She couldn't be controlled. "We contain her," Harrison said. "She's the face of the rebellion. If we let her get too much traction, she'll take this even further." A pause, then a quiet, pointed question. "How do we contain her?" Harrison exhaled. "We find something to discredit her. If we can't, we make something up." The board members nodded. Greg watched in silent horror as the same system that had protected him now worked against someone else. This was how power worked, and now he was on the wrong side of it. At 1 p.m., Natalie received an unexpected visit. A man in his late 50s, Daniel Holloway, a senior executive from First Horizon's corporate division, stood in her office doorway. He was not an ally, But he wasn't an enemy either. He shut the door behind him. "I don't have much time," he said, voice low, "but you need to listen carefully." Natalie sat up. "Go on." Holloway glanced at the window, as if making sure no one was listening. "They're going to try to flip this on you," he said. Natalie frowned. "How?" "They'll dig," he said simply. "Anything. Past performance reviews, minor policy infractions, even personal history. If they can't find something, they'll fabricate it." Natalie let that sink in. "They want you quiet," Holloway continued. "Greg is a liability now, so they'll sacrifice him. But you're the real threat. If they can make you look like the problem, this whole thing disappears." Natalie exhaled slowly. "Why are you telling me this?" Holloway hesitated. "Because I've seen this play out before." His voice dipped lower. "And I've seen what happens to people who aren't ready for it." Natalie held his gaze. "And what happens if I don't back down?" Holloway studied her, then shook his head. "Then you better be ready for war." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing." Natalie raised an eyebrow. Holloway slid a small slip of paper onto her desk. "This is a direct contact," he said. "Someone who used to work for the bank. A compliance officer. She quit years ago, but she knows where the bodies are buried." Natalie picked up the paper. A name and a number. When she looked up, Holloway was already at the door. "Good luck, Monroe," he said. "You're going to need it." The door clicked shut behind him. Natalie sat in silence for a moment, turning the slip of paper in her fingers. Then she reached for her phone. This fight was far from over, and if Harrison Blake wanted a war, he was about to get one. Greg Larkin sat in the sleek, impersonal conference room of First Horizon's headquarters, his jaw locked, his fists clenched under the table. The meeting had barely begun, but he already knew how this was going to play out. Across from him, Harrison Blake sat with his usual air of authority, flanked by a row of board members, men and women in expensive suits, their expressions carefully neutral. A PR executive stood at the front of the room, reading a prepared statement. "After a thorough internal review, First Horizon Bank has determined that Mr. Greg Larkin's actions were in direct violation of our ethical standards. Effective immediately, he is no longer employed with this institution. First Horizon does not and will never condone behavior that disrespects our valued customers." Greg's fingers twitched, just like that. Years of loyalty, covering tracks, and following orders, and they had turned him into a scapegoat without so much as a second thought. "You can't be serious," he hissed. "You're hanging me out to dry?" Harrison barely looked at him. "It's already done, Greg. You'll receive a severance package. Take it." Greg's pulse pounded. He wanted to argue, to point out that everything he had done was exactly what they wanted. But he could see it in their faces. They didn't care. They had sacrificed him to protect themselves. Harrison tapped his fingers against the table. "You should leave now. Security will escort you out." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't over." Harrison gave him a cold smile. "For you, it is." Greg stood, yanking his chair back with more force than necessary. He could feel the eyes of the board on him, dismissing him as if he were already a memory. Without another word, he stormed out. The moment the door clicked shut, Harrison exhaled and turned to the board. "Now that the distraction is handled, let's deal with our real problem." Natalie Monroe. Natalie sat at her desk, her hands resting on the surface, steady but tense. The email had come 10 minutes ago. Mandatory executive review meeting, 2 p.m., boardroom. See no other details, no agenda, but she knew exactly what it meant. Harrison had made his move. Dylan Carter leaned against the doorway, his face tight with worry. "This isn't a good sign," she nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "You think they'll fire you?" Natalie glanced at her laptop, the Chicago Financial Tribune article still open on her screen. The story had exposed Greg, but it had also put a target on her back. Corporate didn't care about justice. They cared about control. "If they could, they would," she said finally. "But they know I won't go quietly." Dylan crossed his arms. "You need backup." Natalie exhaled, her gaze flickering to the office beyond her door. The employees, Sarah Kim, the other tellers, the loan officers, they knew the truth. They had seen what Greg had done, but would they risk their own jobs to stand with her? She wasn't sure, but she was about to find out. The boardroom was colder than she remembered. Natalie sat across from a line of executives, their faces unreadable. Harrison Blake sat at the center, his presence a calculated show of authority. "Ms. Monroe," one of the board members began, folding his hands on the table, "you've made quite a stir." Natalie tilted her head slightly. "I'd say the truth did that, not me." A woman to Harrison's left spoke next. "We appreciate your concerns about ethical banking practices. However, the manner in which you chose to address these issues has caused substantial harm to the reputation of this institution." Natalie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You mean it caused harm to the people who let it happen?" A sharp silence followed. Harrison leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "We have a proposal for you, Natalie, one that will allow all of us to move forward." She waited. "The bank would like you to take an administrative leave, effective immediately," he said smoothly. "It will be framed as a strategic transition. You won't be fired. You'll receive a severance package, and in 6 months you can return, under different terms." Natalie held his gaze. "And if I refuse?" Another board member cleared his throat. "Then we will be forced to conduct a performance review, investigating whether your leadership has caused disruption within this branch. If we find cause, your contract could be terminated for breach of professional conduct." Natalie barely blinked. "So, if I don't leave quietly, you'll manufacture a reason to fire me." Harrison's smile was thin. "That's not how we'd phrase it." Natalie let the silence stretch, watching them. They wanted her gone, but not in a way that would turn her into a public martyr. If she vanished quietly, they could rewrite the story however they wanted. Dylan's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "If we don't do something, this keeps happening." She took a slow breath. Then she leaned forward. "I'll need time to consider." Harrison nodded, satisfied. "Of course, we'll expect your decision by the end of the week." She stood, smoothing out her blazer. Just before she turned to leave, Harrison spoke again. "This is the right choice, Natalie, for your future." Natalie gave him a small, knowing smile. "We'll see." As soon as she returned to her office, Dylan was waiting. "They're pushing you out, aren't they?" he asked, eyes sharp. Natalie sat down, exhaling. "They're trying." Dylan frowned. "What now?" She picked up the slip of paper Daniel Holloway had given her, the name and number of the former compliance officer, the person who might have even more proof of First Horizon's corruption. Natalie reached for her phone. "They want me to disappear," she said. "Instead, I'm going to make sure they regret ever coming after me." Dylan nodded. "Then let's get to work." The boardroom of First Horizon's headquarters was colder than usual. The air was thick with tension, the kind that weighed heavy in the lungs. A long glass table stretched across the room, surrounded by the bank's most powerful figures. Some sat with their hands clasped, others with arms crossed, watching with measured expressions. At the head of the table, Harrison Blake adjusted his cufflinks before leaning forward. His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was no mistaking the sharpness beneath it. "Natalie Monroe," he began, addressing her like a defendant on trial. "Since your arrival at First Horizon, you have created unnecessary disruption, brought negative press upon this institution, and acted outside the chain of command." Natalie sat at the other end of the table, composed, back straight. She met his gaze without flinching. Harrison continued, his tone tightening. "Your reckless actions have forced this bank into damage control. The question before this board is simple. Can we afford to keep you here?" A few board members murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement. Natalie waited. She wasn't here to beg for her job. She was here to end him. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table with deliberate precision. The sound of paper hitting the glass was small, but it shifted the energy in the room. "I think this might help answer your question," she said calmly. Harrison's eyes flickered with the smallest hesitation, but he kept his expression neutral. "What is that?" Natalie didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, watching as some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "This," she said, flipping the folder open, "is a collection of internal reports and financial records that detail a pattern of misconduct spanning several years. Not just Greg Larkin's behavior, but the system that protected him." The room went still. Natalie picked up one of the documents and read aloud. A complaint filed by a customer in 2019 detailing verbal abuse by a senior manager. Status? Dismissed. Another one from 2021 citing racial discrimination in loan approvals. Status? Deleted from the system. She placed the paper down, lifting her gaze to Harrison. And here's the interesting part. Each of these cases had one thing in common. They never reached corporate because they were stopped at your desk. A murmur rippled through the boardroom. A few members stiffened, their glances darting toward Harrison. Harrison's fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, but his voice remained even. That's a serious accusation. Natalie nodded. It is, but it's not an accusation. It's a fact. She reached for another set of papers. And then, of course, there's this. She slid the report across the table. A financial discrepancy report flagged by an internal compliance officer in 2020. Large withdrawals from discretionary funds, funds that were redirected to personal accounts under shell corporations tied to your name. Silence. Harrison's face remained composed, but Natalie could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. A board member finally spoke. Is this document authentic? Natalie folded her hands. I've already had it reviewed by an independent auditor. The weight of the room shifted against Harrison. Another member, an older man with a silver watch glinting on his wrist, cleared his throat. Harrison, do you have an explanation for this? Harrison exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. This is absurd. If there were any real financial irregularities, corporate auditors would have flagged them. Natalie allowed herself a small smile. You mean the auditors you personally assigned? A sharp silence followed. Harrison looked unsure. He knew he couldn't explain this away. The best he could do was stall, but the cracks were already forming. And then, the final blow came. The boardroom doors opened. All heads turned as an older man in a dark gray suit entered the room. His presence carried a weight that even Harrison couldn't ignore. Natalie's lips twitched. She had been waiting for this moment. The man walked to the opposite side of the table and took a seat, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. Then he looked directly at Harrison. Long time no see, he said. His voice was calm, but his presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Harrison's mouth pressed into a thin line. What are you doing here, Robert? Robert Whitmore, former senior executive of First Horizon Bank, retired 5 years ago, but still carried enough influence to shake this room. Robert placed his hands on the table, looking at the board. I heard about the scandal, and I thought it was time to step in. One of the board members frowned. Robert, you've been retired for years. Retired? Robert cut in smoothly. Not disconnected. He leaned back slightly. And I've been watching what's happening here. He turned his gaze to Harrison. This isn't the first time you've buried problems, he said, but it might be the first time someone had the nerve to expose it. Natalie watched as a flicker of panic crossed Harrison's face. Robert continued. I've spoken with some of our key investors. Let's just say they aren't thrilled with the idea of this bank being led by someone who, he tapped the financial report in front of him, has a history of questionable transactions. Another board member, one who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. If this is true, then we can't simply ignore it. Robert nodded. No, we can't. Natalie didn't move, but she could feel the shift. Harrison was losing. He was the one being backed into a corner. One of the senior members exhaled. We need time to review these allegations, but if what's presented here holds up. He glanced at Harrison, his expression unreadable. We may need to reconsider leadership at the highest levels. Harrison clenched his jaw. Natalie said nothing, but she met his gaze. She had flipped the board against him, and Harrison knew it. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating. The air hummed with silent calculations, shifting loyalties, and the weight of a decision that could redefine First Horizon Bank's future. Natalie sat at the far end of the glass conference table, her posture straight, unwavering. Across from her, Harrison Blake leaned forward, exuding the forced confidence of a man who knew he was losing, but refused to surrender. Harrison cleared his throat, setting a printed document onto the table with deliberate care. His voice carried the authority of someone who had steered this institution for years, masking the desperation beneath it. I understand that emotions have played a significant role in recent events, he began smoothly. But at the end of the day, a bank is a business, and businesses operate on numbers, not personal crusades. He turned to the board members, his gaze sweeping over them like a practiced performer reading his audience. Since the media frenzy began, he continued, this branch has seen a sharp decline in deposits from high-value clients. Several long-term investors have expressed concern about the stability of our leadership. He tapped the paper in front of him. This financial report confirms it. If we allow Natalie Monroe to remain in her position, the bank stands to lose millions. A murmur ran through the room. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Natalie's jaw clenched. This was his final play. Twist the narrative. Paint her as the risk, the liability. If he couldn't discredit her outright, he would make her seem too costly to keep. Harrison's voice lowered, calm and precise. Ladies and gentlemen, we must ask ourselves one question. Can we afford to gamble our institution's future on someone who has already damaged our public standing? Silence. The weight of the moment settled on Natalie's shoulders. She knew how these rooms worked. Power didn't shift based on morality, it shifted based on profitability. So she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she made a move he didn't see coming. Natalie reached into her folder and slid a document forward. She didn't slam it down, didn't grandstand, just placed it there and waited. One of the senior board members, a woman named Evelyn Carter, lifted it carefully. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second. By the time she reached the third, her brows furrowed. "What is this?" Evelyn asked. Natalie's voice was steady. "A strategic growth report." Harrison scoffed. "A report?" He gestured toward his own document. "We're talking about real financial losses here, not theoretical projections." Natalie ignored him. "This document outlines a restructuring plan, one that shifts our banking model to accommodate an aging customer base. If implemented, we won't be chasing temporary profits. We'll be expanding into an untapped market worth billions." A few board members leaned in, scanning the pages. She continued, her tone unwavering. "Right now, our bank is bleeding because we've ignored the largest growing financial demographic in America. Older clients. We make it harder for them to bank, and as a result, they take their money elsewhere." She turned to Evelyn, who was still reading. "This plan demonstrates exactly how we modernize services to cater to them. Dedicated financial advisory, streamlined accessibility, fraud prevention measures tailored to senior accounts." She let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "If the board is truly concerned about profits, then the answer isn't removing me. It's fixing the mistakes that got us here in the first place." Harrison stiffened. She had flipped his argument against him. The room shifted. Natalie saw it in the small details. The way some board members adjusted in their seats, the way a few stopped nodding along with Harrison's words. The financial argument had always been his strongest weapon, but now she had one too. The board chairman, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Ms. Monroe, this is ambitious." Natalie met his gaze. "It's necessary." Another member spoke. "How soon can this be implemented?" Harrison's jaw tightened. "You can't seriously be entertaining this." The chairman raised a hand, silencing him. "You had your chance to present a solution, Harrison. Now we listen to hers." Harrison's fingers curled into a fist against the table. He was losing control, and he knew it. The boardroom door opened. A young assistant stepped inside, holding a stack of small black folders. The chairman adjusted his glasses. "We will now hold a confidential vote." The assistant handed a folder to each member. Inside were two simple options. Retain Natalie Monroe as branch director, remove Natalie Monroe as branch director, and beneath them, a second choice. Retain Harrison Blake as senior executive. Remove Harrison Blake as senior executive. Harrison exhaled sharply. He had expected a vote on her, not on himself. Natalie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward as each board member opened their folder, marked their decision, and slid them back across the table. The chairman nodded. "We will now tally the results." Natalie inhaled slowly. This was it. The room fell into stillness, save for the soft rustling of papers being collected. Across from her, Harrison refused to look away. His eyes burned with defiance, but beneath it, beneath the forced confidence, there was fear. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with peace, but the kind that suffocated, thick with anticipation. Every seat around the polished glass table was occupied, but no one moved. No one spoke. Natalie Monroe sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture steady, her face unreadable. Across from her, Harrison Blake sat with his jaw tight, fingers pressed against the table's edge. The weight of what was about to happen hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. At the far end of the room, the board secretary stood, holding a sealed envelope. She adjusted her glasses before clearing her throat. "The votes have been tallied," she announced, her voice even, professional. She looked at the chairman, then at the rest of the board. "I will now read the results." The room tensed. Natalie didn't flinch. She had done everything she could. This moment was no longer in her hands. Harrison, however, wasn't as composed. His fingers twitched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. The secretary opened the envelope. She pulled out the slip of paper, took a moment to scan it, then looked up. "With a vote of 7-4, she said, her voice carrying across the room, "the board has decided to remove Harrison Blake from his position as Regional Director of First Horizon Bank, effective immediately." The words landed like a gunshot. For a second, no one reacted. Then a murmur spread across the table. Some board members shifted in their seats, exchanging brief, unreadable glances. Others remained frozen, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Natalie stayed still, but across from her, Harrison went pale. The color drained from his face so fast that for a moment, he looked like he had been struck. His mouth parted slightly, his breath coming shallow. He blinked once, then again, as if hoping he had misheard. The chairman, a man who had been part of the bank for nearly 3 decades, folded his hands on the table. His voice was calm but firm. "This was not an easy decision," he said, "but it is a necessary one. First Horizon cannot afford to move forward under the leadership of someone whose ethical standing has been compromised." The finality in his tone was like a gavel slamming down. Harrison sucked in a breath, his hands clenching into fists. The room was watching him now, waiting to see how he would react. And then he snapped. Harrison shot up from his chair so fast that it scraped against the floor. "This is a mistake," he barked, his voice shaking, not with fear, but with rage. His eyes burned as he scanned the room, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that someone might change their mind. No one did. His hands slammed against the table. "You're letting a scandal dictate our leadership? Do you realize what you're doing? You're handing this bank over to someone who—" His eyes cut to Natalie, filled with something dark. Natalie didn't react. She simply watched. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "This is her doing," he hissed, pointing a finger at her. "She's manipulated you all. You think she cares about this bank? She's going to burn it to the ground." No one spoke. That silence, the lack of support, the lack of fear, was what finally broke him. Harrison's breath hitched, his shoulders tensed. His gaze darted toward the board members, one last desperate attempt to find an ally. But it was over. The chairman sighed, rubbing his temple. Then he looked toward the security team waiting outside the boardroom. "Please escort Mr. Blake from the building." Harrison's head snapped up. "Wait!" But the security guards had already stepped forward. Harrison staggered back, the full weight of his downfall crashing down on him. His hands shook as he looked at them. "You can't—" His voice faltered, then dropped to something more desperate. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this." No one responded. A guard placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Harrison jerked away. His chest heaved, his eyes burned. And then finally he whispered, "You'll regret this." No one answered. Natalie didn't look away. As the guards led him toward the door, Harrison turned one last time. His gaze locked onto her, filled with hatred, fury, and something else. Fear. She had taken everything from him, and he would never forget it. Then the door swung shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the chairman let out a slow breath, his hands pressing against the table. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that settles it." One of the board members, a woman in her late 50s, adjusted her glasses. "What now?" The chairman turned toward Natalie. "You still have a position here," he said carefully. "What do you intend to do with it?" Natalie exhaled slowly. She had won. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger. She looked out the boardroom window, watching the city below. Then she turned back, her voice steady. "We rebuild," she said simply. And for the first time, the board listened. The conference room was packed. Every chair was filled, and some employees stood along the walls, arms crossed, uncertain of what was about to happen. A murmur ran through the room, whispers exchanged in hushed voices, nervous glances between tellers, loan officers, and senior managers. At the front of the room, Natalie Monroe stood with her hands resting on the table. She didn't need a microphone to command attention. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few weeks lingered in the air. Harrison Blake was gone. Greg Larkin was history, and now the real work began. She let the silence settle before she spoke. "We've let a broken system thrive in this bank for far too long," she said, her voice firm but calm. "And I know some of you are wondering what happens next." Some employees looked down, avoiding her gaze. Others stared, waiting. Natalie took a slow breath. "So let me make this clear. We are not here to preserve the old way of doing things. We are here to fix what was broken, to earn back the trust of the people who bank with us. That starts today." The murmuring stopped. She scanned the room. Some employees looked relieved, others looked terrified, and a few looked downright skeptical. Change was hard, but this wasn't about making people comfortable. It was about making them better. Natalie turned toward Dylan Carter, who stood at her side, a quiet but steady presence. "I want to recognize someone who stood up when it wasn't easy to do so," she said. "Someone who put integrity before job security and did what was right." She turned fully to Dylan. "As of today, I'm appointing Dylan Carter as assistant branch manager." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Dylan himself looked momentarily stunned, but then a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Dylan has already proved his leadership," Natalie continued. "He saw something wrong and made sure it was addressed. That's the kind of leadership we need more of." A few employees clapped, tentative at first, then growing louder. Dylan gave a small nod of thanks but remained quiet. Natalie let the applause fade before moving on. "Now for the real changes." She placed both hands on the table. "Starting next month, all employees will undergo a new round of customer service training, especially in handling senior accounts. This is non-negotiable." She heard the murmurs again. Some employees were uncomfortable. Others nodded. "There will also be a full audit of our past complaint records," she continued. "No more disappearing reports, no more erased transactions. Transparency starts now." She watched carefully as reactions flickered across the faces in the room. Some looked hopeful. Others looked scared. Good. They should be, because this wasn't just a leadership change. It was a reckoning. By mid-afternoon, the bank had settled into a strange but hopeful rhythm. Employees moved differently, not with fear, but with a cautious sense of purpose. Some still exchanged nervous glances, unsure of where they stood in the new order. Natalie understood that. Change wasn't instant. Trust wasn't either. And then, as if the universe had decided to test the very system she was trying to rebuild, the front doors of the bank swung open. Eleanor Whitmore walked inside. A hush fell over the branch. Natalie immediately recognized her. The elderly woman moved slowly, her hands clutching the strap of her handbag. She glanced around, clearly uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if she had made the right decision in coming back. Natalie stood from behind the customer service desk and walked toward her. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said warmly, stopping just a few feet away. "Welcome back." Eleanor blinked up at her. Surprise flashed across her face. Natalie had expected that. The last time this woman had set foot in the bank, she had been humiliated. She had been made to feel like she didn't belong here. That would not happen again. Eleanor hesitated, looking toward the teller line. She started, her voice uncertain. "I need to withdraw some funds." Natalie nodded, then turned toward the counter. A familiar face was there. Mark Gibbons, a longtime employee, one of Greg Larkin's former men. For a moment he froze. Natalie didn't move. She simply waited. The whole branch was watching now, though they pretended not to. A test was unfolding in real time. One man's choice would reveal whether anything had truly changed. Mark swallowed hard. Then, after an almost imperceptible hesitation, he straightened his posture and stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone carefully measured. "I can assist you right here." A beat passed, then another. Eleanor hesitated. Natalie remained quiet, watching. Then finally, Eleanor stepped forward. She placed her purse on the counter, her hands steadier now. "I'd like to withdraw from my checking account," she said. Mark nodded. "Of course, ma'am." He took her ID and bank card, typing into the system. His movements were professional, respectful. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. When Mark handed Eleanor the receipt, his hands didn't shake. "Thank you for banking with us," he said. Eleanor glanced down at the slip, then up at him. Natalie felt something in her chest ease. This was how it started, one person at a time. Eleanor turned back to Natalie, clutching her purse. "Thank you," she said softly. Natalie smiled. "We'll be here whenever you need us." As Eleanor walked toward the exit, something subtle yet profound shifted in the room. A system that had once treated people like her as a burden had just treated her like a valued customer. Natalie believed that this place, the bank, the people, could truly change. She turned back toward the branch, taking in the faces of the employees, the customers, the quiet but undeniable transformation happening in front of her. She wasn't just running a bank. She was fixing what had been broken. The weight of justice had finally come crashing down. At 8 a.m., sharp, a team of corporate investigators walked through the revolving glass doors of First Horizon's headquarters. Their suits were crisp, their expressions unreadable. They weren't here for a meeting. They were here for a reckoning. Inside a private conference room on the top floor, Greg Larkin sat slumped in his chair. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm against the table. Across from him, Harrison Blake sat with his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. A corporate attorney placed a thick folder onto the table. The sound of it landing was like a gavel striking down in a courtroom. "The evidence against both of you is overwhelming," the attorney said, adjusting his glasses. "Embezzlement, destruction of financial records, systemic customer mistreatment. The board has authorized a full-scale investigation, and the authorities have been notified." Greg's throat bobbed. "The authorities?" His voice cracked slightly. Harrison didn't react, but his hands curled into fists. "We traced over $3 million in misallocated funds," the investigator continued, flipping a page. "Harrison, these transactions were linked to shell companies under your name." Harrison didn't blink. Greg, on the other hand, snapped. He shot up from his chair. "This is ridiculous. I just followed orders. I didn't steal anything." His face flushed with desperation. "You think I was the mastermind? You think I—" The investigator held up a hand, silencing him. "You authorized the suppression of customer complaints. You forged financial adjustments. Whether you were following orders or not, you were complicit." Greg sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. The investigator turned to Harrison. "As for you, your influence here is officially over. You have two options. You can resign quietly, walk away with the last shred of dignity you have left, or," he tapped the file, "face the legal consequences of fraud and financial misconduct." Harrison Blake looked shaken, not because he had been caught, but because he knew there was no escape. By mid-afternoon, First Horizon's internal memo was leaked to the press. Greg Larkin, terminated pending legal review. Harrison Blake, resigned in disgrace under federal investigation. The financial world buzzed with the fallout. One of the city's most powerful banking figures had fallen, and at the center of it all was Natalie Monroe. Inside the bank, the atmosphere had shifted. Employees weren't walking on eggshells. There was an unspoken understanding that things had changed for good. Dylan Carter moved through the branch with a quiet authority, helping employees adjust to the new structure. Policies were being rewritten. Transparency was no longer an option. It was mandatory. Natalie stood near the front of the bank, watching as customers moved through the space. The tellers were patient, the managers were engaged, and for once, no one looked afraid. "Feels different, doesn't it?" She turned. Dylan had stopped beside her. hands in his pockets. His voice held something lighter than before. Hopeful. Natalie exhaled. It's a start. Dylan nodded, then hesitated. I heard you got a call from corporate. She arched a brow. News travels fast. He smirked. You're staying, right? Natalie didn't answer right away. Corporate had offered her a promotion, a transfer to a larger regional branch, a chance to take what she had built here and expand it. But as she watched the bank, the employees adapting, the customers being treated with respect, she realized something. She wasn't finished here yet. I'm staying, she said finally. Dylan grinned. Good. Later that afternoon, as Natalie was preparing to leave for the day, she noticed an older man standing hesitantly near the entrance. He wore a faded military jacket, the patches on his sleeve telling a story of service long past. His hands were calloused, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp. Natalie approached. Can I help you? The man glanced at the customer service desks. A while back, he said slowly, I came here to cash a check. Natalie's stomach tightened. She already knew where this was going. The man exhaled. Your old manager, Greg, he told me my check wasn't valid, said I needed real proof that I earned that money. Wouldn't even look at my paperwork. Natalie swallowed down the familiar anger. I'm sorry that happened to you. The man met her gaze. I left that day feeling less than human. I swore I'd never set foot in this place again. A beat of silence. But today, he said, looking around, I thought I'd try again. Natalie exhaled, her voice steady. And? The old man smiled. He said, I felt like a customer again. Natalie felt something in her chest tighten, then ease. This was why she fought. Not for corporate, not for politics, but for people like him. Power doesn't corrupt. Unchecked power does. Natalie Monroe's battle wasn't just about one corrupt executive. It was about dismantling an entire system that thrived on silence and fear. Her story reminds us that real change doesn't happen overnight, and standing up for what's right often comes at a cost. But the question remains, how many people look the other way when they see injustice? And how many are willing to fight, even when the odds are against them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories of power, justice, and redemption.